little bit more on this topic of the condition we'll get. I met with a professional psychopath a couple of weeks ago.
Professional?
Certified. And on his way to prison, we were trying to work out a get for his wife. Very bizarre situation, but this guy tried to revive this discussion about giving a get on condition. What's the condition? Well, he's going to prison. He didn't want to say prison. He's going to a safe place. That's what he wanted to call it, a safe place. So he's going to prison for what's going to be a number of years because there are 5 pending indictments, mostly on drug and weapons charges. I'll send you the article. So he's going to prison for a nice long time, and basically he said, I'll give her a get, but only on the condition that he gets his visitations and he wants partial custody of the child. I mean, this guy, ironically, won't have custody over himself when he's in prison, and he somehow believes that he's entitled to custody over the child. So he is a professional psychopath. But this is a request that a lot of very crazy people, mostly husbands, make, which is that there is such a concept in the Gemara as a get given on a condition. And the oldest example that we have is the example from David HaMelech and his soldiers. So the Gemara says like this: they would give a get that if they don't come back within a certain number of days or months, it's 30 days, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, then their wives are divorced from the time the get was given, right? And that's not to encourage their wives to step out during the 6-month waiting period. It's just that this was to prevent what's called igun. We've mentioned this word before. All get in Hebrew means an anchor, like a ship's anchor. And the classic example of what we today call an aguna was a woman who is anchored. In other words, she doesn't know where her husband is. He went to sea. He was on a Malaysian airplane. He disappeared, and they're not having a good year, these Southeast Asian airliners, not having a good year. So he disappeared. It was in a plane or a boat, or he was taken prisoner, or he may have been killed, and maybe he wasn't, and maybe he's alive, and maybe he's not, and maybe she's married, and maybe she's not, and maybe it's 10 Commandments, and maybe she's a single woman. In fact, if her husband died, she could marry a Kohen. There's no interdiction Kohen to marry a widow. It's just a divorcee. So the example given in the Gemara is just this. So why would someone give a get on a condition? Not because he's trying to extort something or get something from her necessarily. On the contrary, he's trying to do something noble. He wants her to be able to move on in the event that he's not able to make good on the condition. And the Gemara says that in fact this was common enough that people used to do this before they traveled. And the Gemara, it's a famous story, it appears a few times in the Gemara, of a man who gave his wife a get, and he said, this is your get from this very moment. That's the way the process works. He either writes it or has someone write it for him, and in front of witnesses, he hands it to her and he said, this is your get. You're divorced from me, permitted to any man, etc. So he gives her the get and he says, this is your get, on the condition that I failed to return within 30 days, and as the sun was setting on day 30, the guy is running home, and he's closing in on the town, and he comes to Shemuel, was the Rab, not Shemuel the Navi, but Shemuel the Amorah, who hears him running and screaming, he's shouting, Hazud Atai, everybody see that I'm coming, but he didn't make it by the time the sun set. And so he said, his wife is divorced. If he wants to take her back, she can renegotiate the ketubah. She has more experience. She's a more accomplished mother. She's a more accomplished wife. She's a better cook than she was when they got married.
But except that's not a big deal. He can remarry like the next day.
Her.
He can remarry her the next day.
Who said she wants to? Maybe she wants to trade up or... Come on, man.
So maybe that's why he was running so fast.
It's a free market capitalist system. I mean...
Trade up.
So
Uriah and Bathsheba was a conditional thing. That means she might not have been divorced. The divorce is only once he's been gone for 30 days or something.
Should he not return home within defined period of time? It has to be defined.
Right, then she's divorced.
Defined period of time. Then she's divorced.
From the moment
he gave her the get.
It's valid.
So it's not, you'll be divorced when I fail to return. It's you're now divorced unless I return. Is how you read that.
So you're divorced until the moment that I return within this time period. So if I'm
Well-
I'm divorced after day 30, and then day 30 I'm married to you.
No.
No.
If you don't return,
You're divorced now, unless I come home within that period of time.
And if he comes home,
And
she
from now,
was
I
never
mean
divorced.
from now.
if
So
I
the
don't,
moment he leaves, she is divorced.
yes,
But if he comes back within,
she's not.
The get never happened. Yeah.
then 30, he comes back within the 30 days. That's it. They live together again.
Think of like stock options. I don't know if you're familiar with the financial markets.
Okay.
So I buy an option. I can
So she's
I
not
can
allowed
purchase
in
a
that
stock at a
time
certain.
period.
No, like if you buy an option, you say I can buy this stock at a certain price, and the thing might just expire the next day, and be like, I have a contract to buy it, but
So technically, she
Might not
could
be
go
there.
become someone else's wife within the 30 days.
No.
No.
And like that's what
No,
the
she
oh,
Not
could
within.
become
well,
someone else. She could have
no, that's
coffee.
with Batsheva. That's why
Well-
David was. That's
not espresso. I mean,
She could technically marry a guy for 10 days during his 30-day period. That's what King David did. That's what he.
So what would happen would be like this: that marriage would be in effect unless the condition were broken, in which case the get never happened, and that marriage becomes adultery, and the children become unzivir. So she could theoretically do it,
She could get married for 10 days within the 30-day period and then divorce the guy at the end of 10 days. And then the other one will take.
but she might later find out that the get didn't happen. It's a conditional thing, so it's effective from the time it's given unless the condition is
So
broken.
then how is David not committing adult? How is a kid not a mamzer?
Because he never went home, and because the condition
Oh.
was broken, the get was valid from the minute he gave it to her, which
So
was
he
months
manipulated
before.
it further than just.
No, he tried to tell him to go home, and on the contrary, David was willing to deal with adultery. He said,
He
fine,
didn't
I
say-
made a mistake.
He didn't say the reason.
He didn't tell him why, right, but he said, go back to your wife. And Uriah says, how can I go? My brothers are fighting.
Right.
I refuse to do what you told me to. At that point, the Gemara
So
says, really,
then that
he
kid
already-
would have been a mamzer for sure if he would have gone home.
Yes,
If
yes.
he would have actually gone home, there
That's
would have been the
correct.
sin of a mamzer.
Yeah.
That's correct. Well, I mean, adultery is the technical sin, but the production of
The
a
kid
mamzer
would have
is
been a
And he
mamzer.
was
an
trying to
added
cover it
benefit.
up. He was trying to have him go home and become the father to that mamzer, and then there would have been a mamzer that no one would have known about.
See, I don't know that that's what he was trying to do.
No, because-
really, what,
What-
if that's the case, then he was basically
No.
he was accusing himself of adultery.
Exactly.
It's not that he was going to hide the paternity of the child so much as he was going to say, I did commit adultery, and as a matter of fact, she was married, and now I'm in big trouble. But at least
If the husband, if
So he
But-
would have been fine that there would have been a mamzer out there. He would have been fine that this mamzer would have been.
he
He
sent
would
him
have
back to
Would
acknowledged
have
his
dealt with it, I
parenthood, He
guess.
would have acknowledged, I'm the father of this kid, and I created a
he
mamzer.
probably would have had to, yes. He probably would have had to. In fact, that's the weird aspect of the story because it basically put Batsheva in a position where she had to explain to her husband what she did. Which is,
That's not very
I
nice
thought
part.
he was trying to cover it up. I thought he was going to try to make Uriah look like the father.
No,
That's what he was saying,
because
go home to her.
when the father went home, he
Yeah.
would have found out that.
right.
No,
I mean-
she wasn't. She was newly pregnant. He wouldn't have known.
Well, she
They
told
didn't
him
have paternity tests in those
No,
days.
she told, the paternity test, but her husband was out of the house for a couple of months. I
Yeah.
mean, it would have been
Right,
a...
but she had
an
just
But it's
immaculate
if she
conception.
came
She's
home-
not like 2 weeks ago.
No,
But she's not allowed to him anymore because she slept with another man. Right?
Correct.
So
If they
she's
were
not
married.
allowed to her husband
She
anymore.
would have had to explain to him, I'm not allowed to be
So
there
there
anymore
was no
because-
secret
And
as
David
to
anymore.
who's the child was not her
Well, plus
husband.
he was gone for a few months, and incidentally, what the Gemara says was that she had just immersed herself in a mikveh because she had her period, so she knew she wasn't pregnant up until then. When she becomes pregnant, she notifies David, who later sends for her husband. I mean, time's going by
Yeah,
here. It's
exactly.
not like
It's many
it wasn't
months.
one day to the next. It was more like
It's many months.
probably a few weeks
Oh, so
to a
she
few
would have.
months.
Okay, so she would have obviously been pregnant.
So she told him I'm pregnant.
So
She
what
Not
basically-
I
David,
understand
Uriah.
why-
Uriah would have come home and she would have been with a belly. Like it would have been obvious that it was.
I
That's
mean,
what I
a
mean.
bigger, smaller belly. Women weren't as thin then as they are today. It's a topic we'll have to develop at some point. but- Huh?
Why did David ask him to go home?
Why did David?
King David asked Uriah to go back home.
The only possible explanation is because he was prepared to face adultery. He was prepared to deal with this and say, "Here's my teshuvah. I did something wrong. I'm not going to try to weasel my way out of it. Let him go home. Let me be guilty of adultery because the get didn't happen, and then it's not retroactive. It's just that now the situation has been clarified, and I was guilty of adultery, and I'm willing to face that."
So it was a way of.
How is he
It wasn't
gonna
about
face
covering
it?
up. It was a way of
Is that part of the
part of the
teshuvah?
teshuvah was saying I made a terrible mistake. I'm going to deal with it.
Acknowledging it and recognizing it and making it public.
I will publicly repent for having done this.
Well, why didn't he just tell him?
Uriah.
Yeah, why didn't David just tell him?
He left it to Bathsheba to tell.
I mean, well,
That doesn't make sense. I thought he wanted him to go home so that he would have relations with his
You see,
wife,
he did.
and then he would think that that was his
Well,
own
That's what I
kid.
thought.
No,
That's what I
she was
thought.
already pregnant.
She was already
pregnant.
pregnant. I mean, like
But
it wasn't like she was late by a few days. I mean, she told him I'm pregnant, and by the time he summons him back from war, he's coming from Jordan for the love of God. It
She was
wasn't like
already
he got there
pregnant.
overnight. There was no train. I mean, it was probably a month or two
Which
before he
is
came back.
not necessarily visible that soon.
I mean,
And if he told him,
I don't. I think we're talking about probably at least 3 months. The Gemara usually assumes 3 months before it's clear that she's that she's pregnant. I mean, so she missed 3 periods. Basically, she's pretty sure that's what the story is. But anyway, David didn't tell him. I mean, one possibility is because it actually wouldn't have been the case until he actually went home.
oh yeah, it's true.
So he could tell him, I violated your marriage, but the reality is that until he goes home, that's not factually true. In fact, after he dies, it wasn't true.
It's
It's a little bit.
But
of
if
the
he,
truth.
Because it
hadn't
Yeah, I
sent
mean,
out
he
to
would
the,
he would have confessed something which is what
Which hadn't
was-
happened yet.
hadn't happened if he doesn't go home.
No, in fact, what we had to tell him was go home. If you go home now, I'm guilty of adultery. And then you would think the logical thing would be just
I thought he
don't
was
let him
trying
go
to
home because you don't want to be guilty of adultery.
but if he was really wanting to do tshuva, he wouldn't have sent him back out to the front to get killed.
There, the Gemara says that
That's
by
it.
Uriah refusing to do what he told him to, he was rebelling against the
Maybe he
king.
was upset.
The
Exactly.
king has the authority to execute people, and there we're told specifically that he was punished for not having. If already you wanted to execute him for rebelling and doing the opposite of what you told him, he did it in a very insolent way. He said, "On your life and on the life of your soul, I'm not going to do what you told me," which is pretty much spitting in the king's face, without him knowing the background of the story. But what Natan HaNavi says in the name of Hashem is that Hashem is disgusted with David for having sent him to die at the hands of the Ammonim
Instead
The
of
enemy.
instead of
just
executing him
killing
himself,
yeah.
meaning he was entitled to kill him himself. And again, why doesn't he kill him himself? Maybe because that would be even worse. And it's like, look, I killed him so I could take his wife. So no, let him go to war. If Hashem wants him to die there, he'll die there. But I'm not going to execute him just so I can take his wife. After he sends him to war and he says, go ahead and send him to a place where it's dangerous or let him be killed, like he deserves to be killed, but I don't want to kill him. And so Hashem punishes him not for causing his death, but for the way he did it. That's clear. That's like black and white.
so
Natan says Hashem is disgusted with you for having done this, for having sent him to die at the hands of the Chitim, of the Ammonim, when you yourself, and not you punishing him yourself. So you're kind of dancing, you're straddling the fence. You didn't tell him what happened, but he didn't make it adultery for you, so that was still up in the air. Then he got upset and indignant, and he berated you, and you had the option of punishing him for his rebellion against the king, which you chose not to do. Instead, you sent him to die at the hand of the enemy, which is unjustifiable, meaning if he deserved the punishment, it should have come from you. So he did make a number of questionable judgment calls, but at the end of the day, it began with him trying to, fess up and step up to the plate and take responsibility for what he did. Go home, you do what you need to do, this is my problem and I'll deal with it.
so
And he refuses to comply with that.
So why does the rest of the Jewish people have to suffer from it?
Oh, back to Yon's question. So, I'll give you a really easy answer. I mean, why does the Jewish people have to suffer because we have such an incompetent Knesset? The nation has
Incompetent what?
Knesset,
well, we voted.
Israeli parliament, huh?
No, on that point, we voted for them.
Every time I think about
We
this,
made a mistake. We voted for some
The-
stupid people.
Israel,
That's our mistake.
when Israel, Israel,
Yeah.
I think, assassinated one of the members of the beginning of the Hamas government when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2005, and so the Palestinians said, okay, because the Israelis killed one of the members of our perfectly legitimate parliament, we're going to start kidnapping and killing members of the Israeli parliament. I remember my father heard that and he said, take them all. He said, just doing us a favor. In fact, we'll all live and breathe much more easily if the Knesset is liquidated.
Terrible.
I mean, but they need to be euthanized, these people. They're just incompetent. And I mean, they did euthanize. In fact, go back to the shiur of a few weeks ago. They did just liquidate the Knesset and they called for early elections because they realized they're incompetent and they can't get anything done. So it's a nice admission on their part. It's the beginning of Teshuvah. Again,
It
there are
seems to be
consequences.
like a thing in the whole world now. Like every government.
That politicians are incompetent.
It's like
and-
all
Now,
governments.
back to
Can we get back to
the topic. I had a question.
Sure.
So why don't we do this for the IDF now
Why don't we?
or the spies?
Oh,
like
so
Why
right.
don't we do what?
So the question on
the conditional get.
the conditional get. So basically,
That's how it is nowadays.
a get that was given on a condition is valid. It has to be given. The validity of it has to be immediate, even if it's suspended pending the outcome of a particular condition. But again, there's no such thing as a get that you'll be divorced in 3 months. If this happens, you're divorced now. If what happens in 3 months happens or doesn't, is going to determine whether or not this took place. Okay? Well, how the technical details work out, the Gemara explains that that's how it has to be. It can't be otherwise. So, the more technical question is, first of all, why don't we do this today? And second of all, if there was a place to do it, why don't we do this in the IDF? We would expect soldiers that are married. Ron Arad.
Ron Arad, I was gonna say, yeah.
Classic story, right? The guy was married, disappeared. I mean, fell into Iran. Plane was shot down, and there was one picture of him with a very, very long beard. So apparently he lived for at least a few years after he was. And they said that apparently they believed he was dead at some point. They just killed him. But, so the question is, why don't we do this? So. In general, it's been 400 or 500 years that we really, the Batei Din shy away from conditions when it comes to Gittin because you're playing with fire. If the status of this particular marriage is up in the air, then, the condition may be disputed. And a husband can say, well, I gave the get, but I meant for the get to be given on this condition and not that one, or I interpret this as satisfaction of the condition and you interpret it differently. And you've got the status of the marriage, of the wife, of the kids still way up in the air. Maybe she's married to an adulterer and the kids are mamzerin, and maybe they're not. No big din, no competent big din wants this on their heads, and it's a little bit sloppy. It's much easier for us to say, listen, come to a consensus, give the get, and without conditions, just make sure that it's final and conclusive, and that she's unhindered in her ability to go ahead and marry anyone else except for a Kohen. Everyone's happy, there aren't too many doubts or questions. If ever there was a place to give a get on a condition, it would be in the IDF. The idea had been brought up in the past. Unfortunately, and probably for not very good reasons, it wasn't really adopted by the army. A number of concerns were brought up. One of them was, maybe the times have changed, but not necessarily for the better. So it sounds like the responsible thing to do would be, sure, if an Israeli soldier ends up in the hands of the Arabs, God only knows. You see what happens when Arabs end up in the hands of the Arabs. I mean, it's not any more fun when you're Jewish, and it's terrible, and this can go on for years. I mean, Gilad Shalit wasn't married, but imagine he was. I think it was almost 5 years in captivity. It would have been a very torturous situation for everybody. Plus his wife, if he were married. So one of the suspicions, I think Rav Yosef commented, he weighed in on this also, was that your average soldier in the Israeli army is not yet so observant. And in such a case, and under such circumstances, our suspicion is that you'll end up with an awful lot of divorced women. And since today everybody's got such a quick trigger finger when it comes to trading up and trading out, so we got married, it was nice, it was fun, lasted as long as it lasted. Now that it's done, it's done. I'm tired of you anyway. So the concern is that the get would ultimately serve to uproot the very purpose of the ketubah in the first place. What's the purpose of the ketubah?
To provide
so they would
livelihood.
intentionally disappear.
Not they would intentionally disappear, but that if for whatever reason they don't come back, they would not necessarily go back to their wives, which is also not really in the spirit of Halakhah. In other words, If a guy, for whatever reason, goes to war and he gives a get that you're divorced from me from this moment, if I don't come back within 30 days, and the war goes on for 35, or I say 60 days and it goes on for a few more months, or he ends up in captivity, or he ends up going on a mission that just requires him to be in secret or hiding or whatever, you'll end up with a certain number of divorced women, and the question is then, how do we as a society look at this? If the guy is not observant and doesn't really feel all that committed to the religious institution of marriage in the first place, then there's a chance that he just might not be so interested in perpetuating the marriage and say, okay, we're divorced just as well, I'll go do my thing, you go do yours. It's a concern because the general purpose of marriage, and we do try to encourage people to work things out, stay together, but if they're not observant or if they're not really interested, the purpose of the ketubah, the Gemara says, is what?
To give a protection to the wife.
Literally, in the language of Chazal, "Kadei shelo teh kala be'einav lo tziah." So his wife should be difficult to divorce, so she shouldn't be such an easy thing for him, like replaceable, disposable. Well, whatever, we got married, it was cute, didn't work out, so I'm moving on. Moving on, okay, so go ahead and pay her 1 year of salary, room and board, etc. And you'll think a little bit differently, because Chazal know that men are very loyal to their wallets. So you put your financial interests in line with the marriage, and so you have a financial disincentive to divorce, and it's not bulletproof, but it helps. So if we, as a matter of course, give every army wife a get, without a doubt, a certain number of them will end up divorced, perhaps more than we originally intended. How long do you make the term, by the way? So the shorter the term, the more divorced women you're going to have. The longer the term, the longer she's going to have to wait until he comes back. So what's the goal? The goal is to facilitate remarriage or to preserve the original marriage. This becomes a little bit politically sensitive. If I want everybody to take their marriages seriously, so I can say, don't give the get on a condition if you don't come back within a year. Is it my business to tell a woman how long she has to wait when her husband disappears before she can go ahead and start her life? What if she's relatively young and she wants to move on? What if she's in her late 30s, early 40s and may not be able to have kids unless we actually, afford her the opportunity? So these questions become very, very complicated. The overriding concern, though, that the Poskim mentioned is that they have a sensitivity to the degree of commitment to the marriage itself. In other words, do we know for a fact that every guy who goes to war and ends up coming back late is actually going to go, respect the original marriage and go back to what it was? If in the time of David HaMelech, people took their marriages a little bit more seriously, then it might have been a great idea, because it wasn't an excuse to take the money and run. This was more, the situation could potentially be disastrous, I don't want you to get stuck. Which, by the way, is very interesting if you think about European perspectives on romance, right? The Jewish perspective on romance is, I love you, so I want you to be free and find happiness with someone else in the event that I can't try to free you. Not one of these, please stay chained to me forever, we can both suffer in perpetuity and, make our lives miserable. No, if I like you, I'll let you go free. You want to come back, you can. If not, that's fine. We'll arrange the equitable distribution of the assets and everything will be okay. So. It's maybe not the Disney movies that we grew up on. It's not Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast, but it does shed some light on the kind of things that you do for people that you like, which is not keeping them chained to you if they don't want to be there. So it's an interesting question. The idea behind it would be to prevent people from getting stuck, or to prevent a woman from not being able to remarry. At the push comes to shove, it's not that it's something that's impossible to do. The army refused to adopt this as a standard policy. I've never met one Israeli soldier who actually did this. I think the Rabbanut, for reasons that maybe seemed valid to them, might be making a potentially big mistake here, because what you don't want to have happen is for a situation to arise in which someone does get stuck in captivity for a long time. I don't think that helps the institution of marriage very much either. If you're familiar with the story of Marad, by the way, his wife did remarry, and I don't think she waited for the Rabbanut's permission to do it. It's a pretty publicized case, because if she had asked the Rabbanut, they would have said, as long as we don't know if he's alive or dead, unfortunately, we can't really give you an answer. I mean, we can't tell you can go ahead and remarry because for all we know, he's still alive.
But she would have been remarried by a rabbi then, because no rabbi would have married her.
I mean, it doesn't make it less adulterous in the
No, how
event
she
that
got
he's still
how she got
alive.
married?
Either Cyprus
To Cyprus,
or
like she went for like a civil.
the Rabbanut didn't do it. But in the beginning, the question was asked. See, it's another whole complicated story. If we had known for a fact that that even if we didn't know for a fact that he was dead, but that he was in a situation that most people wouldn't have survived. So if I knew for a fact that he was in a plane that crashed, right, the chances of surviving a plane crash aren't very good. So even if we didn't know for a fact that he was dead, like we didn't have the body and he was never identified, knowing that he was in a plane crash or that he was in a burning building or that he was in a ship that sank, we could have come to the conclusion that chances are he died, and then even halakhically we would allow her to remarry.
It happened this summer actually.
What's that?
It happened this summer actually. What you just said.
What's that?
Like there was this soldier Adar Goldin, and he was. I think he was just married, but they never found the body. But they did a medical analysis, and the rabbi decided that given what they saw, nobody, like, with a good probability, he shouldn't have survived with what they saw, so they declared him dead.
Right. If I remember the
Although
story,
they didn't find anybody,
I think they found blood. Blood too.
They found his liver.
yes, they found body parts.
How did he die? What was an accident?
Dans le tunnel, dans un des tunnels.
One thing, like,
In a tunnel.
bombe, ouais, c'est une bombe quoi, une maison piégée.
I think, by the way,
Je crois qu'il avait kidnappé.
my
Qu'il était revenu.
my brother-in-law's brother-in-law, so my wife's brother, his wife had a brother who was in the army at the time, but like deep in the army at the time. Apparently, what happened is that there's a protocol they call the Hannibal Protocol. Are you familiar with this? Hannibal. That if a soldier is taken into captivity, that it's better for the soldier and for the nation at war to just kill him.
Oh yeah.
So what they did was, I think they actually did intentionally detonate the tunnel with him inside it, and they just needed proof that he was dead. But that him being taken was going to be very dangerous for a lot of reasons, and other soldiers might have been killed in the process. So it looks like that's what happened, but the soldiers were told this. When you get drafted into the Israeli army, they tell you this is what they're going to do.
Well, the thing is, they also bombed the entire district. Like they had a suspicion that the Hamas had taken him into a district, and the artillery literally destroyed the entire district.
Right. So they did. If I remember correctly, they found a few body parts, and they said, okay, so we don't need. In theory, could someone live without a finger or without a part of his liver? Maybe, but probably not. But anyway, the point, at least when it comes to the policy, is that as a matter of public policy, the Israeli army, for reasons that I don't necessarily agree with, does not recommend that soldiers should give their wives gitin for a number. Also because they're concerned that if they're not religious, they might not understand. Look, we had trouble understanding the conditional get concept. Right? I mean, there are very explicit gemarot about this and how they used to do it, what kind of conditions they used to give, but it's not such an easy topic to understand. For people who are barely observant, tell the guy, listen, you're giving your wife a get in front of a beit din. I know it looks like you're divorced, but you're not. And go and tell his wife, you might get lonely while he's away, but still.
You're married.
I mean, you're right, you're still married. You have a get on your mantelpiece, in your library, and still you're not actually divorced. So there's a concern that it might actually inspire more adultery than marital fidelity. So there's the problem of what happens if he comes back and for whatever reason he's fighting with his wife, or he saw her post a picture on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, some guy, I don't know. So he can say, okay, I'm tired of her, I'm not going back to her, but at the same time...
Don't you tear the ketubah when you do a get?
Not in this case, you wouldn't. Because it might actually still be valid.
But in the traditional...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What happened in the traditional case of divorce would be you appear before the Beit Din, and the ketubah has to be paid out. So he gives the get, I mean, he cuts a check. He cuts a check, or he gives them money, and he says, here's the...
That's not good at all.
Yeah. So the ketubah would be torn up because it would be like an IOU, basically. If I borrow money from Emanuel and I say, I owe you $1,000, And he comes back with this contract, you know, Avidan can owe him $1,000, so when I pay him back, I get the contract back and I rip it up.
Yeah.
So the ketubah is no different than any other contract in that sense, that either we sign it and that it was fulfilled. So we would have two witnesses who sign it and say, yes, it's true, this is what I promised you when we got married, and here's the proof that I paid it, and that's it, and I keep a copy and you keep a copy. Or we just, you know, tear it up such that no one can claim this is a valid document and come afterwards with a complaint. But the problem is, when you're dealing with people who are largely non-observant, the confusion that arises out of him giving a get and thinking she's divorced, and her getting a get and thinking she's divorced. Now what happens if they do or don't abide by it? What happens if she cheats in the meantime, but it wasn't cheating, but now it is because it came back?
It's complicated.
It becomes, well, as a matter of public policy, for millions of soldiers, it becomes very difficult to
Maybe
follow
not for millions, but what they could do is, for example, people who go on very sensitive things like undercover or things like that. That could be their policy could be different for those kind of cases for a standard soldier.
Do you remember we mentioned this very briefly? We were talking about the spies.
Yeah.
And what do we say about the spies? That in the event that, well, in this particular case, it's more sensitive if it's a Jewish woman than a Jewish man. But if a Jewish woman is going undercover and going to be living with some guy in order to get information from him or whatever.
Yeah, that it would be mutar in a way, but
well, I mean,
not recommended.
At least she should be divorced before she does it. Even if she wants to remarry the same guy when she comes back, probably it's better that she should, you know, and be divorced and not be guilty of adultery if she's doing this voluntarily, because not necessarily. It doesn't mean, once again, you can do something and be forgiven for it. Doesn't mean that there are no consequences to it. Esther Malka did realize that by approaching Achashverosh, she had lost her marriage, but she was prepared to deal with the consequences. So she says, "Kasher avati avati. If I already lost my father's house, I may as well lose my husband too, because at least this will save the nation."
But Bathsheba couldn't have been with her husband because she had committed adultery, right? Even if he came back.
Well, again, if he came back, she was guilty of adultery only when he returns, right? She would basically have to tell him when he walks in the door, I'm not permitted to be with you because now I'm still married to you, and therefore I was married to you then also, and therefore...
So she would have had to get a divorce.
So he would have had to divorce her, correct. Yeah. David would have dealt with him, with himself, with his committing adultery, and she would have had to work that out with Uriah. So, yeah, I don't want to run over...
Just a quick aside question. If a woman has adultery with a man who isn't Jewish, is that get a mamzer or no, because the man wasn't permitted to her in the first place?
So, right, well, not permitted to her in the first place. I mean, her brother's not permitted to her in the first place, and that child would be mamzer, but...
Oh, her brother would be a mamzer?
Well,
because that's incest. Incest, right. Okay.
The general rule is either she's married and she has relations with anybody but her husband, voluntarily anyway, or incest, some kind of relationship that's forbidden anyway.
But is it considered adultery, like if the man isn't Jewish?
It's considered adultery in the sense that, yes, just like with Esther, even though Achashverosh wasn't Jewish, she wasn't allowed to go back to Mordechai. But we do hold that Goyim don't make mamzer anymore, interestingly enough, because there's no such concept as kiddushin. We don't recognize the concept of kiddushin in them, so the child will not be mamzer.
So if a woman is married with a goy, and then she has a child with someone else, the kid is not a mamzer.
Correct, because we don't recognize the marriage as a marriage. And
but it's still adultery. She's still not allowed back to her husband.
To her non-Jewish husband? Yeah, I don't know.
No, her Jewish. If she's married to a Jew, she has a relationship beyond her husband's back with a non-Jew. So that's still adultery, and she's still not allowed back to her husband, the Jewish husband.
Correct. Yeah, right, a bit morbid as way as far as conversation, but it's an idea that has some merit to it. Yeah, the other, at least from a public policy perspective, I think the Rabbanut could at least allow observant soldiers to do this.
Allow, sorry?
You don't have to force everybody to do it, but I think the Rabbanut would do well to at least allow observant soldiers, religious guys, to say, look, I understand the concept, my wife and I are both observant, and we would still like to do this so that she doesn't get stuck if stuck, we're happy. So,
Jazakallah.